On a spring afternoon in 2015, two people in Hong Kong, China set out for a car trip. It wasn't supposed to be anything special. In fact, this was a route the pair had taken dozens, if not hundreds of times before. But on this particular day, very quickly, something strange would begin to happen. After traveling only a short distance down the road, the driver and passenger started to feel really weird. So much so that they would end up kind of hastily pulling over to try and figure out what was going on. Fast forward to about 2 hours later, and the car still had not moved from this spot. The reason why, though, and the exact circumstances behind what had happened inside the vehicle that day would become a massive mystery. It was a case that would grip the Hong Kong public for almost a decade. As always, my name is Nigel, and welcome back to Crime Zone. A reminder, if you find today's video interesting and informative, be sure to like and subscribe for more true crime stories told with a mysterious and suspenseful vibe. With that out of the way, let's dive in. For many years, husband and wife Khaw Kim-sun and Wong Su-fing were the envy of almost everyone they crossed paths with. The couple had seemingly managed to crush it in pretty much every aspect of life. They had fantastic careers, a beautiful family, and a huge amount of financial success. What's more, they had done it all despite fairly humble beginnings. Kim-sun and Su-fing were both originally from Malaysia, specifically from a state called Penang. Penang is located in the northwest of the country, close to the border with Thailand. However, this is not where the couple met. According to news sources, the pair didn't run into each other until the late 1980s, when they both happened to be working at the same hospital in England. At the time, Su-fing was a nurse, and Kim-sun was a medical student. He had already become a doctor back in Malaysia, but now he was working on his postgraduate degree and was training to be an anesthesiologist. Kim-sun and Su-fing were immediately drawn to one another. In addition to having their common Malaysian heritage, they bonded over their shared love of food and outdoor activities like skiing and hiking. In 1992, they got married, and a few years later, they welcomed their first daughter, May. It was around the time of May's birth that the couple's fortunes really started taking off. By this point, Kim-sun had finished school and was a full-fledged anesthesiologist. He got an opportunity at the Prince of Wales Hospital in Hong Kong, and the young family decided to relocate there in 1997. Originally, this was only supposed to be for like a year, but it soon became apparent that Kim-sun was a rising star in his field. He had this rare blend of incredibly high skill and professionalism, but also charisma. He was friendly and funny, the kind of person that others really enjoyed being around. As people started taking notice of Kim-sun's talent, more opportunities followed. He would go on to become an associate professor at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Here, he produced groundbreaking research, contributing to medical journals while simultaneously continuing to work in the field. At the hospital, he was known as someone who was always on the cutting edge. He wasn't afraid to adopt new techniques and challenge traditional wisdom. Colleagues described Kim-sun as clever and avant-garde, and he became a highly sought-after speaker at medical conferences. Now, Su-fing was no slouch herself. She was also quite gifted academically and had always been an excellent student growing up. According to family members, she was one of those people that had an aura about her. You know, that sort of effortless elegance and charm that she somehow managed to make look easy. While Su-fing definitely could have continued building a respectable career of her own, when she and Kim-sun put down permanent roots in Hong Kong, she turned her priorities towards the household, especially as their family continued to grow. After May, the couple had 3 more children, 2 more daughters named Lily and Carly, and a son named Kaming. For roughly the next decade and a half, things only got better for the Khaw family. As you might imagine, Kim-sun was bringing in quite a lot of money, and he and his family were able to afford a very comfortable existence. They all lived together in a beautiful 3-story house in Ma On Shan, a coastal town in Hong Kong's New Territories. When they weren't there, they would often spend their weeks at their vacation home on Lantau Island. For those unfamiliar, Lantau Island is home to a ton of Hong Kong's tourist attractions, including the Big Buddha and Hong Kong Disneyland. If this all sounds incredibly idyllic, that's because, by all accounts, it was. However, in 2015, something would happen. something that would not only flip all of this on its head, but would forever change the Khaw name in Hong Kong, from a name associated with affluence and prestige to one synonymous with tragedy. Shortly after 3:30 p.m. on May 22, 2015, a woman named Tang Yuling was on her way home. Yuling was a nurse, and she had just finished up a long shift at the local hospital where she worked, when something caught her eye as she was driving. It was a yellow Mini Cooper, one that was stopped in kind of a strange way at the side of the roadway. This was a 2-lane road, meaning that there was only a single lane for traffic in each direction. But in this particular area, there was also a small transit stop, so there was an extra little cutout where the buses could pull in. It was here that the Mini Cooper was sitting. It was sort of parked at an angle, its windshield wipers were on, and its engine was running. Now, this was weird, but initially Yuling didn't think much of it. The weather had been kind of crappy and rainy all day, so she figured that even though the driver was illegally parked, maybe they had just pulled over for a second to deal with something. But Yuling would end up passing by the area 2 more times that afternoon. After getting home, there was finally a break in the bad weather, so she decided to seize her opportunity and head out for a quick jog. When she did, she noticed that the Mini Cooper had not moved from that spot. What was stranger, the engine was still idling and the windshield wipers were still going, even though it was no longer raining. On the final time she went by, curiosity got the better of her, and Yuling decided she would check the situation out. As she approached the car, at first, it didn't appear like anyone was inside. When she got right up and looked in, though, she realized that she was mistaken. There were actually 2 women in there. One of them was middle-aged, and the other was quite a bit younger, but both of them had been hard to see because they were slumped down in their seats. For a moment, it looked like the women could be sleeping. However, it quickly became clear that this was not the case. Yuling tried knocking on the car windows repeatedly and even opened up one of the doors and started nudging the women, but neither of them was waking up or responding at all. That's when Yuling's nursing training kicked in. She checked the women's pulses and found that both of them were very weak. Something was seriously wrong here, and she immediately called for help. When emergency responders arrived at the scene, it was just after 4:15 p.m., and the women were rushed to a local hospital. Once there, doctors did everything they could, but neither of their conditions improved. Over the next couple of hours, things only got worse, and sadly, before the end of the evening, both of them had been pronounced dead. By this point, police had managed to figure out who these women were. There were 2 Hong Kong ID cards in the Mini Cooper, which identified them as 47-year-old Wong Sufing and her 16-year-old daughter, Lily. Now, this was tragic for a lot of reasons, but one of the most heartbreaking things about it was how this bit unfolded. You see, the hospital that Lily and Sufing were brought to was the Prince of Wales, the same one where Kim's son worked. He was in surgery at the time all of this happened, though. Immediately after he got out, he was informed about what had taken place, but by this time, it was too late. All he could do was visit his wife and daughter one last time before their bodies were taken to the hospital's morgue. While Kim's son managed to mostly maintain his composure, the whole thing was devastating to watch for his friends and colleagues. Here was this normally very in control, social and friendly guy, and for once, it was like he had absolutely no words. Everyone wondered, how could something like this have happened to such a beautiful family? That's exactly what police wanted to know as well. At first, the situation had been treated mostly as some kind of traffic incident, but it was becoming clear that this was not the case. There was no visible damage to the Khaw family's yellow Mini Cooper, nor were there any obvious injuries to Sufing or Lily's bodies. So, what had happened and how had they died? Well, authorities were about to get their first clue. It came when the coroner noticed a small but important detail during the women's autopsies. When Sufing and Lily's bodies were examined following their deaths, initially the coroner didn't find much of anything. There were absolutely no classic signs of trauma. Cuts, scrapes, bruises, puncture wounds, stuff like that. But there was one thing that stood out. Both of the women had a sort of cherry red hue to their skin. Now, without context, that might not mean anything to you. However, it definitely did to the coroner. You see, this kind of flushed skin, especially without any other indications of something wrong, is a telltale sign of carbon monoxide poisoning. You know, the colorless, odorless, extremely deadly gas that we should all probably have a healthy fear of. Sure enough, when Lily and Su Feng's remains were sent to a larger police lab with more resources, they were able to confirm this. Both women had extremely high levels of carbon monoxide in their blood. So that was definitely what had killed them, but this was a mystery in and of itself. Through interviews with the rest of the Khaw family, as well as their housekeeper, a woman named Siti Mesero, police learned that May 22nd had started out as a pretty average day. Aside from the oldest daughter, May, who was in Malaysia attending medical school, everyone began the morning off at home. Su Feng had dropped the two youngest kids, Carly and Kaming, at school before heading back to the house. Lily didn't have school at all that day, so she stayed behind. At around 12:30 p.m., Kim's son left to go to work. He had a seminar to attend and a class to teach at the university before heading to the hospital for the scheduled surgery he was taking part in. Not much else happened at the Khaw residence until shortly after 2 p.m. That's when Su Feng and Lily set out in the yellow Mini Cooper. They were planning to go shopping, run some errands, and also pick up the other Khaw children from school. Sadly, they would never arrive. Based on these accounts, as well as text messages that Lily had sent to one of her friends, police were able to narrow the timeline a little further. They estimated she and Su Feng left the family home sometime between 2:14 and 2:18 p.m. Here's where things got really crazy, though. The area where the Mini Cooper was recovered was only about 1.6 kilometers, or just under a mile from the house. It was on Sai Sha Road, the very first main roadway that Su Feng would have turned onto when they started driving. Police estimated that it would have taken the women just 4 minutes to travel to the spot where the car pulled off the road. For reference, carbon monoxide can be lethal at levels as low as 1,600 parts per million in the air. But in this concentration, it still usually takes the average person about 20 minutes to experience symptoms such as headaches, dizziness, and confusion. For the women to become so incapacitated so quickly, there would have needed to be a pretty large amount of carbon monoxide in there. Enough that they would have not only felt these symptoms very quickly, but also would have fallen unconscious before they could try and get to safety. In terms of how this could have happened, for obvious reasons, the very first thing police considered was a possible vehicle defect. After all, car engines produce more than enough carbon monoxide to be deadly. But after extensive testing and diagnostics, authorities weren't able to find a single thing wrong with the Mini Cooper. There were no malfunctions, no breakages, nor anything else that could have caused a gas leak. They would ultimately spend months looking for anything else that might explain the situation, during which time the vehicle was searched top to bottom. All of the items inside were also looked at, but there didn't appear to be anything noteworthy. Just some clothes, knickknacks, and some random exercise equipment. No stone was left unturned, though, and eventually police even brought in experts from the vehicle's manufacturer in Germany. They couldn't find a problem either, so it wasn't the car. The vehicle defect being ruled out was a big deal. The carbon monoxide that had killed Lily and Su Feng had to have come from somewhere, and if it wasn't from the car itself, that also meant that this probably was not an accident. Someone had intentionally put the gas there. In order to understand how, though, and more importantly, why, police would need to dig deeper into the dynamics of the Khaw family. Because, as it turned out, things inside their home were nowhere near as perfect as they had tried to make them seem. After concluding that Su Feng and Lily's deaths were not accidental, police began to change their focus. They started looking closer at the lives of all of the Khaw family members, but particularly those of the deceased mother and daughter. What they found was fairly compelling. Prior to her death, Lily had been under a lot of stress at school. Coming from such an overachieving family, there was a lot of pressure to perform. As I mentioned before, the eldest Khaw child, May, was already in the process of following in her father's footsteps. But Lily didn't have these same interests. She was definitely very bright and had a way with people, but she was more of an artist. She loved acting, singing, dancing, and fashion. This had often caused conflict between her and her parents. They felt that she needed to pay more attention to school. Kim Sun told police this was even part of the last conversation they'd ever had. Before heading to work on May 22nd, he had encouraged Lily to use her day off to stay at home and focus on her studies. When police began exploring Su Fing's personal life, they found a similar story. She was also clearly dealing with a lot of stress and had been struggling with her mental health for a number of years. A diary of hers that investigators were able to recover provided a heartbreaking window into her inner thoughts and feelings. In it, she expressed over and over again how she'd failed as a wife and mother. Su Fing talked about how she was impatient, irresponsible, and quick to anger, and how her husband and kids wanted nothing to do with her. She wrote things like, quote, "When my husband is talking to me, I'm engrossed in watching television," and quote, "I didn't give anything back. I became selfish. I took and took." After learning all of this, police began to wonder, was it possible Su Fing or Lily had been behind what had happened? That they had been desperate enough that one or both of them had decided to intentionally end their lives? Those close to the women were quick to shut this theory down. They said that while Lily and Su Fing might have had their challenges, both of them also had a lot to live for. Lily had a ton of friends, and at the time of her death was feeling optimistic about the future. She may not have been the golden child, but she was finding her own direction in life and was learning to embrace her passions. Despite how it initially seemed in her diary, Su Fing was also in a good place. According to her family members, over the last couple of years, she'd really started to turn things around. She'd attended this coaching workshop called the Transformation 70 Experience that had really kicked things off, and she'd also started seeing a psychologist. Several people told authorities it was like she was her old self again. She was connecting better with her children, she was more easygoing, and she just generally seemed a lot happier. But Su Fing's family weren't just adamant that she and Lily wouldn't have done this to themselves. They told police they were looking at everything completely backwards. The problems the women were having, indeed, the problems the entire Khaw family were having, weren't random or self-imposed. They were coming from a particular place. They were coming from Kim Sun. Su Fing's sister, Su Fong, told authorities that despite his charming exterior, Kim Sun was extremely manipulative. She said that there was no doubt he was a brilliant man, but that same intellect that made him a revered doctor, well, he was more than willing to use it to make his family members miserable. Kim Sun demanded a lot from his children. Like him, they had to be the best at absolutely everything. In his mind, he had given them a lot of advantages, so that came with certain expectations. He was incredibly strict with the kids, and no matter how much pressure he put on them, would constantly tell them how easy they had it. But according to Su Fong, this was nothing compared to how Kim Sun treated his wife. As hard as he was on the children, at the end of the day, their failures, in fact, anything that he saw as a failure or a shortcoming in the family, that was her fault. For example, Kim Sun had been insistent that they and the children learn Mandarin. He said this would give them an edge in life and business, and really pressed Su Fing to teach all of them. Now, Su Fing had never studied Mandarin or learned it in school. She tried her best, but when she understandably struggled, Kim Sun blamed her for the entire family's lack of progress in learning the language. This was despite the fact that Kim Sun himself did not know Mandarin. He spoke English at home, just like his wife. In the end, he brought in a PhD student he was working with to tutor the kids, but made sure to point out how badly Su Fing had failed. And that whole situation was by no means an outlier. Kim Sun would berate Su Fing over anything and everything, no matter how small. Her sister said this is what police had been reading in her diary. All that stuff about her being a lazy, selfish, terrible mother, none of that was true, but Su Fing thought it was because she had internalized years of emotional abuse. In reality, Su Fing did absolutely everything for her children and her family, but Kim Sun had broken her down until she was just this shell of a person. Su-Fing's family also had a theory as to why all of this had been happening. So, you know that Mandarin tutor that I told you about? The one that was also Kim Sun's PhD student? If you thought that was a little suspect, well, you'd be correct. Her name was Shara Lee, and she was also Kim Sun's lover. Kim Sun and Shara had been having an affair for years. The timelines are a little fuzzy here in terms of exact dates, but Shara began tutoring the Khaw children all the way back in 2004, and multiple sources suggest they were already together by this time. Of course, Su-Fing suspected that something was up for a long time, but Kim Sun always denied it. That was until 2013, when everything kind of came out into the open. Even after it did, though, Kim Sun was not apologetic. He basically told Su-Fing it was her fault because she had failed as a mother and a wife. It gets even worse, though. At the same time that Kim Sun was breaking down his wife emotionally, he was also trying to turn the children against her and encourage them to have a relationship with Shara. But remember, I also said that Su-Fing had started to get better mentally and emotionally over the last couple of years before her death. Well, her family explained that this was because after kind of hitting rock bottom, Su-Fing had been proactive. She had started attending those coaching and self-improvement workshops and had started seeing that psychologist. Initially, Su-Fing had done this believing she needed to make herself better for her kids and her husband. But as time went on, she started to realize that she was not the problem. Not only that, but she began to rediscover things that actually made her happy. Her children, her hobbies like cooking and baking, and her friends. You could see this reflected in her diary, too. In the more recent passages, Su-Fing had started treating herself a lot more kindly. She wrote many times, quote, "I am a passionate, committed, and loving woman." Su-Fing also began to realize the common denominator in most of the unhappiness in her and her family's lives was her husband. She was sick of the way he treated her, sick of his affair, and sick of the example he was setting for their children. You see, despite demanding excellence from everyone else, Kim Sun was perfectly fine with cutting corners in his own life when it suited him. He would even brag about doing this. Su-Fing's sister would later tell the media in an interview that he had a motto, quote, "Whatever you do, it's not wrong if you don't get caught." Anyway, sometime in 2014, Su-Fing had started to build back up her self-esteem, enough that she told Kim Sun that she was done. She wanted a divorce. Initially, Kim Sun had agreed to this, and they had actually started the process, but after a little while, he changed his mind. He said he wasn't going to go along with any of it. This was not because Kim Sun felt guilty or realized that he was in love with his wife and wanted to win her back. No, Su-Fing's family members said that he realized that if they went through with the divorce, Su-Fing would be entitled to a large portion of their sizable shared assets, and there was no way he was going to let that happen. So, for about a year after this, there had kind of been this uneasy stalemate in the house. Kim Sun and Su-Fing basically lived separate lives and only interacted for the purposes of raising their children. Right up until Su-Fing and Lily suddenly and inexplicably died. This was all a pretty big bombshell for police. Up until now, Kim Sun had kind of been flying under the radar as far as the investigation was concerned. Hearing all of this laid out, it might sound like a no-brainer that he should have been considered a suspect from day one. But keep in mind, none of this was super obvious from the beginning. As I said before, looking into the car defect alone took months, as did piecing together all of the details of the family's personal lives. On top of this, Kim Sun was playing the part of the grieving husband and father very well. He had everyone absolutely convinced that he was heartbroken by what had happened. But with all of this now in hand, it was clear to police that Kim Sun definitely had a motive, at least when it came to his wife. What wasn't so clear, though, was the same problem they'd had from the start of the investigation. How had Su-Fing and Lily been killed? Well, as it happened, authorities were about to figure that out, and it was by far the most shocking part of the whole case. After learning about the tension in the Khaw household, police turned their focus towards Kim Sun. They began asking him more difficult questions, ones about his affair, his relationship with his wife, and their issues in their marriage. Kim's son was very upfront about the problems between him and Su-Fing, but he said that the things that investigators had heard from his wife's family were overblown. He claimed they had decided not to go through with their divorce, not because he was refusing to cooperate, but because he and Su-Fing had reached an understanding. They would stay together for the sake of the children and treated the marriage more as a business relationship. But the more that police spoke to Kim's son, the less they found him to be convincing, especially when he talked about his relationship with Shara Lee. According to Kim's son, his wife was fine with it. After all, the reason they had gotten together in the first place is because Su-Fing wasn't there for him, and he was lonely. Based on what investigators knew, they didn't buy this. They suspected that Kim's son was done with Su-Fing, but he knew he couldn't separate from her legally without splitting their money and property. In his mind, divorce wasn't an option. He needed her out of the picture entirely. In terms of how Lily had gotten caught up in all of this, police had a theory about that too. In fact, it was Kim's son who'd given them the idea. Remember their last conversation on May 22nd? It was him encouraging her to stay home to study. He had never intended for Lily to be in the car with Su-Fing that day. This could have also explained why Kim's son's reaction at the hospital and throughout the early investigation didn't raise suspicions. He might have genuinely been surprised to learn that Lily had also been killed. But authorities knew they had a major problem. If this was a murder, as they now suspected, how had it been carried out? Especially if Kim's son was responsible. Going back to the timeline, Kim's son had left the house at 12:30 p.m. on May 22nd, nearly 2 full hours before Su-Fing and Lily, and countless alibis confirmed that he was nowhere near them or the Mini Cooper at the time that they had died. Investigators were completely stumped, but they were determined, so they started double-checking everything that they'd done so far, looking through all of the evidence and stuff they'd collected since the beginning of the case, and even seizing a ton of new stuff from the Khaw house that they thought could be relevant. At one point, they even took the flour from the family's pantry to examine it. This might seem like overkill, but police knew they were dealing with a very intelligent person here. And given Kim's son's background in medicine, they wanted to cover all of their bases. As it happened, this was one of the best decisions authorities would make. As they were going through their ever-growing collection of evidence, one of the things that was reviewed was something they had taken from the trunk of the Mini Cooper. You might remember that I mentioned there was a random bit of exercise equipment back there. Well, specifically, there was a deflated gray yoga ball. At the time that the car was first inspected, police were looking mainly at vehicle defects, so this didn't really catch anyone's attention. But while this new review was happening, one of the investigators noticed something. There was actually a specific moment when this happened. The detective looked at the ball and then said out loud to everyone else in the room, "Why is it sitting there without a plug?" The plug the detective was referring to was the little stopper that's part of inflatable balls like this. You know, the piece of plastic that stops air from escaping? Well, it turned out this hadn't been misplaced or anything. It was just missing entirely. That meant that the yoga ball would have been slowly leaking as it sat in the back of the Mini Cooper. That gave police an idea. What if it wasn't air that was in the yoga ball? What if it was, say, carbon monoxide? Sure enough, when authorities sent the ball off for analysis at a lab, testing showed that the interior rubber of the ball was saturated with carbon monoxide. Police didn't want to celebrate prematurely, though, because there were still plenty of other unanswered questions. For example, was there any proof Kim's son had access to carbon monoxide? And was it even possible for there to be enough of the gas in a yoga ball to kill 2 people in the way that this had all unfolded? To answer that latter question, investigators did a whole bunch more tests. To say that these were revealing would be an understatement. With the help of experts, they were able to conclude that not only would the yoga ball have been able to hold a sufficient amount of carbon monoxide to be deadly, the levels could have reached as high as 7,000 parts per million. So well over 4 times that lethal limit I mentioned earlier. On top of this, the tests concluded that this level could have been sustained inside the Mini Cooper for well over 2 hours. That meant that Kim's son could have put the ball in the trunk and gone about his day, leaving it to slowly leak deadly gas until Su-Fing and Lily unwittingly got inside. As for Kim's son's access to carbon monoxide, that also ended up being easy to verify. You see, right around this same time, he had one of his colleagues order tanks of carbon monoxide to their lab at the university. And when police looked into this, they discovered that some of the gas was missing from the lab's inventory. The final nail in the coffin, so to speak, came when authorities conducted another search of the Khaw home, and they found something very interesting. In a drawer in Kim's son's bedroom, there was a small piece of plastic. They weren't able to 100% verify this, but police were convinced it was the missing stopper from the yoga ball. On September 11th, 2017, Khaw Kim's son was arrested right after he finished teaching a class at the university. It had taken more than 2 years, but authorities were now confident they had their man. Of course, as I'm sure you've figured out by now, things were not going to be that easy. The case against Kim's son was entirely circumstantial, and he had a seemingly endless amount of explanations and excuses for why he was actually innocent. He also had a huge amount of supporters, colleagues, students, family members, and former patients, all of whom came to his defense and offered their support. Now, Kim's son's defense shifted a lot, but essentially it boiled down to some version of the following. The carbon monoxide was part of experiments he was conducting on rabbits to research techniques about how to better treat and resuscitate patients who had been poisoned. Kim's son said that he had taken some of the gas home from the lab in 2 yoga balls, but it was to kill pests that had been giving the family problems. He claimed he never intended for anyone to get hurt, and that he never put either of the balls in the Mini Cooper. He said that what must have happened was that Su-Fing or Lily had done it, either as a bid to take their own lives, or because Lily was terrified of insects. He said she was the only one he told about the yoga balls, and she might have misunderstood what was in them. Maybe she had assumed it was an insect killer, so she put it in the car with her and her mom when they left the house that afternoon. This is what Kim's son and his defense team argued when the case went to court. Though, as I said, a lot of the details shifted. This even included what pests Kim's son was trying to kill. Sometimes he said it was mice, sometimes it was rats, and sometimes it was insects. The most ridiculous explanation, by far though, came when Kim's son was put on the stand and he said that the family was dealing with a shrew problem. I bring this up because I think it just really speaks to how much the man literally blamed his wife for everything. He told the court that the shrews had been attracted to the house by a Spanish ham that Su-Fing bought during a, quote, spending spree. Prosecutors did their best to weave all of the facts of the case together, though. They talked about Kim's son's lengthy affair, how he didn't want his wife to get any of their shared money or property, and how he generally worked to make everyone around him feel inadequate. They also showed how he had been able to procure the carbon monoxide and how he had admitted to bringing it home. They pointed to the stopper that had been found in his bedroom, and they attacked the experiments he was doing to justify obtaining the gas in the first place. Experts in the field testified that Kim's son's so-called experiments had little, if any, clinical value. At least one went as far as to call the tests a complete sham. And while they didn't have definitive proof of Kim's son putting the carbon monoxide-filled yoga ball in the Mini Cooper, they did have testimony from the family's housekeeper, Siti. Siti said that on May 22nd, Kim's son had gone out to the area where the family kept their cars before he left for work. When he did, he went out a door they normally didn't use to come and go. She also stated that when she saw Su-Fing and Lily leave later that afternoon, neither of them was carrying the yoga ball. When the trial was over, Kim's son was found guilty, but even this wasn't the end of the case. You see, he immediately appealed, and though it took a few years, Hong Kong's highest court ended up overturning his conviction. They did this on the grounds that the judge had misdirected the jury regarding the plastic stopper that had been found in Kim's son's bedroom. From what I understand, basically the argument was that through the judge's direction, the jury hadn't been adequately instructed to consider alternative explanations about whether it actually was from the ball and how it had gotten there. The case was retried in November of 2024, and the whole thing played out all over again. This time, Kim's son even fired his lawyers 9 days in and decided to represent himself. Unfortunately for him, the jury sided with the prosecution, reaching a verdict in less than 4 hours. Upon being convicted of killing his wife and daughter for a second time, Khaw Kim-sun was sentenced to life in prison in January of 2025. And so, after nearly 10 years, it seems that the case, which is now widely known in Hong Kong simply as the Yoga Ball murders, has finally come to a close. I gotta say, this is one of those cases that scares me. It's terrifying to think that there are people out there that are both this evil and also this smart. I think what's particularly chilling is the level of work Kim-sun put into covering his tracks. Like, those experiments, they may have been completely bogus, but he apparently did everything through the proper channels and made them look as legitimate as he possibly could. Now, you might say that the whole thing with the yoga ball was always going to be obvious once police discovered that Lily and Su-fing had died of carbon monoxide poisoning, but I'd argue this was the biggest part of Kim-sun's plan that didn't go the way he intended. I think that what he thought was going to happen was Su-fing would become incapacitated on the road to the point that she'd get into an accident, and then either the accident would have killed her, or it would have obscured what really happened. Obviously, this is pure speculation on my part, but I'm sort of basing this off of something police said themselves. They admitted that if things had gone differently, there's a chance that this would have been handled by the traffic division of the force. And if that happened, very likely this wouldn't have been investigated further. Of course, the most awful part of all of this is just how senseless this all was. Particularly with Lily, since she almost certainly was not even intended to be a victim, but also with Su-fing. I mean, really, you're gonna kill your wife because you're too cheap to come to a proper divorce settlement? This would be horrible regardless of the situation, but especially in this case. Like, dude, you're a renowned doctor and a university professor. You're going to be fine. You're going to make plenty more money. Anyway, most of all, I feel terrible for the rest of Kim-sun's children. Arguably, they lost both parents, and I have no idea how you navigate something so horrible. I just hope that wherever they are, they've managed to stay together through this dark time, and that it hasn't destroyed the rest of their family.
Before we wrap up, we'd like to take a second to give a huge shout out to everyone who has made it this far into the video. Seriously, thank you so much for watching. If you found today's upload interesting and informative, we'd be honored if you'd consider liking and subscribing, as well as hitting the notification bell and selecting all notifications to stay up to date with our latest releases. If you're looking for additional ways to help support the channel, we'd love to have you join us over on Patreon. Patrons get ad-free and early access to all of our content, as well as 4 additional stories per week for each of our Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International videos. You can learn more at patreon.com/crimezone, where you'll also find some of the fine folks whose names are currently on screen. All that being said, we understand that not everyone has the means to support financially, and that's totally okay. We appreciate every like, sub, share, and comment that you send our way. Once again, thanks so much everyone, and take care.